must be a year of action for race and inclusion in sport. It's brought to you in association with British Future and the Asian Media Group. Uncle Desai sends his apologies for not being able to chair today's live event. My name is Barney Chowdhury and I'm an editor at large for Eastern Eye. I'm honoured, humbled and delighted to be with you for the next 75 minutes. I know that we've got some stellar organisations in our audience, so may I thank you in advance for joining us, and I look forward to asking some of your questions later. So before I start to chair this panel discussion, let me explain that racism in cricket and more widely in sport is something I've been reporting on for the past 40 plus years, formerly for the BBC and now for my newspaper. Of course, a lot's happened over the past few months. The stunningly honest and heartbreaking story of Azeem Rafiq is now well known. We know that since he blew the whistle on racism, much has been written and discussed. In fact, it's a story that's not going away, is it? Even today, we had an apology from Yorkshire's interim coach, Ryan Sidebottom, for saying that the club should try and forget the Azeem Rafiq scandal. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall at his meeting with Lord Patel of Bradford, who's overseeing much needed change at the club. So to help me unpick and make sense of where we are, and just as important, where we should be heading in sport and cricket, I have a great panel of experts. Sundar Katwala is the director of British Future, an independent and non-partisan think tank which works on identity and immigration, integration and race relations, with a focus on engaging the public constructively in issues which can be polarising and divisive. Halima Khan is the founder and director of Opening Borders, a not-for-profit organisation which harnesses the power of sport and channels it into community cohesion, gender equality, and all-round better health for communities. James Butler is an experienced radio broadcaster and a sports journalist who runs and presents the Cricket Badger podcast, the biggest independent cricket podcast. Panel, welcome and thank you for joining us. So, James, let me start off with you first. You actually broke the Azeem Rafiq story in great detail in August 2020. Could you just talk us through exactly what happened?
I knew Azeem. I come from this from three distinct kind of viewpoints, really. I was a fan of Yorkshire County Cricket Club. I then worked for Yorkshire County Cricket Club as the media manager. I knew Azeem during that period. And then ever since, I've covered it as a broadcaster and journalist. And I interviewed Azeem on my podcast in August 2020. He'd done an interview with Wisdom a week or two before that, but we got a bit further into the racism stuff. I'd had Michael Carberry on my podcast about 2 months prior to that, where that had gone a bit viral when he'd said racism is rife in cricket. And then off the back of that, I started to take a bit more interest, to be honest. To my shame, it's not something that had ever really kind of crossed my path before. But when Azeem came on and talked on my podcast, then we talked off record, and we've spoken pretty much every day since August 2020. Obviously, it opened my eyes quite widely, and I tried to support him and get the story out there.
So you were involved with the club for a long time, since 2007, I think.
I worked for the club for 6 years.
Yeah. So when you were there, you didn't see any of the vibes that have now come out.
I think it's with institutional racism and with obviously from Azeem's allegations, they were very specific to him. I'm not saying I never saw anything that made me feel uncomfortable when I was at the club, because I did, but I didn't. It's not something where you walk around the corridors of power at Headingley and everybody's using the P word every 5 seconds. That isn't how it was at all.
Yeah, never does.
But obviously, from Azeem's personal point of view, it was something that hit him very hard and hit him. I mean, having spoken to him over the last 18 months, 2 years, whatever it's been now, I know how low he's felt at various stages in the process, and it's really affected his life. I mean, well documented that he considered suicide while still a player. He reported his allegations in 2017 and 2018. The club just turned a blind eye and didn't do anything about it. And I think I've heard a lot of people say he's only after the money, he's after trying to kind of get some kind of reputational gain from this. I can say, after speaking to him all the way through this process, never mentioned money once. It was all about just having the respect from the club that that they listened to him and acted appropriately if the need arose.
Thanks, James. Halima, you too have links with the club. Would you explain what they are?
Yeah, thank you, Barney. So I've done quite a lot of stuff with the club over the last 5 or 10 years, mainly on a voluntary basis. So quite a bit of coaching with them. There was a stint around 2015, if I remember rightly, that I was managing the Yorkshire under-15s team. And I've done quite, as you mentioned, with my organisation, Opening Boundaries. We've held quite a few events linked in with Yorkshire County Cricket Club around raising awareness of women, South Asian communities, and issues around gender inequality in sport.
And when you were there inside Headingley and working with the club, with the women's cricketers, what were your experiences?
But I was going to say, Barney, at under 15, you definitely don't get the privileges of coaching inside at Headingley or even stepping onto the to the turf to play a game.
Perhaps we should
So
change them.
our game, the under 15, maybe that is something that should be changed. The under 15, if they're going to be called under 15 Yorkshire women's cricket, they should be able to play at the ground. But the environment, if I'm honest with you, you could tell that there were quite a lot of cliques. Parents kind of knew the coaches knew the parents, and it was almost this system where talent at time didn't matter, but if you had the right parent, you were going to go up the kind of player pathway. But it's not to say that there were people in there trying to get through the kind of talent and the player pathways. I think it was sometimes, from my opinion, seen as a bit of a closed shop. So you would always see the same people coming through the system, coming through the talent pathways, and there was no really room for others to come into that, or it would be quite difficult for them to come into that environment.
I've heard that quite a lot from people I've spoken to. One of the things they say is that, of course, cricket is expensive, and you've got to buy the gear, and coaches speak to one another, so you can almost be blackballed. Did you ever come across that in your
Yeah, and it is an expensive sport, and the challenge that you have is, one, you can turn up with equipment, but actually when you've got some of the county girls that are there from affluent backgrounds, the parents have got that disposable income to pay £200 for a bat, to pay £90 for pads and so on. You don't have that income, so you're turning up with the bare minimum. There's also a complexion issue that you then start to have. So if you do get players coming in from kind of Asian and ethnic backgrounds, when they're looking at their counterparts, they don't feel like they belong in that environment, because guess what? My bat cost me about 20 quid because it's all I can really afford. And, people are there with their, and that's not to say that, they've got that income, they can spend that on how they want, but it is the environment then that can start to feel quite uncomfortable. And I can understand why, if you're a young Asian girl, or even if you're a young black girl, you sometimes come into the environment thinking, I'm going to play for my county, I want to then go and play for my country, but you slowly start to detach because you don't feel like you belong in that environment, and you can't keep up with the pace of the other girls, not just from a player's perspective or an athletic side, but also from a kind of, I haven't got the best kit every season, or my kit isn't brand new every time I start the season.
Thank you, Halima. Sundar, let's turn to you, and let's broaden it a little bit, because I read your interview with Press Association about the fact that social media has a lot, and that you've been a victim of racism in football. Just tell us a bit about your experiences in sport, and what's been happening in terms of racism.
Well, I think sport is so important, I think, to identity, race, social connection in our country. It's a sport mad country for lots of people, not everybody, but it's also really formative. So, I had, to the extent that I had views about identities, what was open or closed to me in terms of being, Indian or English or British or Everton Football Club or Yorkshire Cricket Club. You have an experience, you have a formative experience of that as a 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 11-year-old, before you start to have views about those ideas about identity when you're 15, 16, 18. So, my first experience of sport was just being absolutely football mad as a 7-year-old, and on a sort of 3 or 4 year long campaign to be allowed to be taken to a match, because my friend Andrew could be taken for a match. So I was quite a naive, I think, 7-year-old. We're in sort of Merseyside in the early mid 80s here, but I eventually got to go to the matches, went to a lot of football matches. But by the time I was a teenager, the kind of overt racism you could hear and see, because Liverpool had signed John Barnes and Everton had no black players, was absolutely astonishing. So I'm slightly in the position of maybe, wanting, have I picked the wrong team here? My fellow supporters are singing Everton are white at the opposing team because they've got this England stuff. And that was my route into social, issues, campaigning, identity. The kind of work I do arose out of my teenage experience of Norman Tebbit saying, why didn't your dad support England? And that experience at Everton Football Club. I feel I'm in my 40s. I've seen change in our society for the better across the generations quite powerfully, but I've also lost that change in the last 3 years personally, because I'm back to getting more racism in my life every day than I have at any other point for the last 30 years, because I talk about race in public. I'm one click away from, any bigot in the country. If I want to say England brings us all together, that's really happening, then 90% of people agree with that. Now, the people who don't, they can harass me, and if Twitter and the police don't do anything about that, and sadly they don't, then I'm I'm in a worse position than I was when I was 11, because we dealt in the football stadium with that racism by sort of 1994. You couldn't do it anymore. You got policed, you got chucked out. Kick It Out had been founded, and the culture shifted slowly, I think, over the generations. By Euro 96, it felt welcoming. It wasn't very diverse, but it felt less aggressive and less threatening. So different sports have been going on these different journeys, but I think sport drives the conversation because it's something we're interested in, something that brings us together potentially when it works, or something where the pain of segregation, separation, being put in your own box is very evident from a very young age.
If there's one thing about sport, it's very tribal, isn't it? If you think about it for a second, it's you support Everton, I support Coventry, and we meet on the football field sometimes. And it's tribal from the moment we start. And then you've got the added complication of the fact that we're people of colour, and that produces even more angst among the fans.
But Barney, I think tribes are part of the answer here, potentially. And I think, we used to think, when I was 15, 16, that sport just was something that brought out the worst in people. So football was about hooliganism, football was about racism, football was about nationalism. But if you want to have the tribe of we are Bradford, we are Leeds, we are Yorkshire, we are Everton, we are Liverpool, we are England, and everybody's invited, then it's actually a really powerful thing to aspire to and get. And I think Everton is much more like that as an idea, now than it was then. But there are always people working for that to be the case, So in places like, Leeds United or Bradford, there's been that argument over decades. So I think, Yorkshire County Cricket Club was the institution that cricket missed an opportunity for half a century in this country, because it wants to be the national sport. It's been slipping away, and you had Commonwealth communities who came in thinking it was the number one sport. And I think cricket lost the black community. It never lost the Asian communities, but it somehow it's a story of separateness across Yorkshire. So Yorkshire County Cricket Club is the institution we most want to get it right in a way, and that's why it's such a tragedy that there's so much work still to do.
Halima, you're actually in Yorkshire. And I just wonder, from your viewpoint, what you see happening as a result of the fallout of Azeem Rafiq's whistleblowing, how it's affecting communities, how it's affecting sport, what's the feeling on the ground?
Sure, Bonnie. I just wanted to comment, Sunder, on your point there about the kind of tribes and the divides there. From my perspective, especially at a grassroots level, I always saw the opposite. Sport was the only place that I would come and I would see so much diversity. So when I would come and play and coach in the teams, I would see, a kind of demographic of different people. I wouldn't see that if I just went out in my community, or because of the environment that I was brought in and living in Bradford, very predominantly South Asian communities. It was the only time when I started playing cricket that I would see, women of different diverse backgrounds, both physically and unseen diversity as well. When I'm talking to them, they've just got so many different backgrounds. I think the divide, and again, it's my opinion, starts to happen when you move up that ladder, when you move away from the participation, you move away from the grassroots, and then you're trying to get into the, I suppose, as you mentioned there, that system of club environment. And that's when you start to see maybe less and less of it. in answer to your question, Barney, I think with regards to what has this done in communities and people, I think it's lost a lot of trust. Yorkshire and even the England Cricket Board, only a few years ago developed the South Asian strategy, and there was so much resource that was put behind it. And I've seen myself some of the efforts and interventions that Yorkshire have put in place to try and engage with South Asian communities. And it's really sad in one sense that I feel like all of that has gone. Nobody remembers that anymore because of what's happened now with the Azeem Rafiq case, and lots more people are coming forward and talking about their experiences. So whilst it's really sad on that side to see that and think all of these years of work in the South Asian strategy hasn't, really maybe hit the mark where they wanted to. At the same time, it's also a strong, Azeem Rafiq has been really strong in coming forward, and it needed to be done. So it's such a mix of emotion where you go from it was really strong and brave and that needed to be done to then equally at the same time saying, but it's really sad as well for this sport that we've come to this. And, personally, on a personal level, I love cricket, watch it, play it, coached it, and I've worked with so many young people and adults in club environments trying to engage through sport, but use it as a wider social tool as well around cohesion, community, bringing people together. And this very much is doing the opposite of that. So we have to take the opportunity that's come out of all of this and try to change the face of cricket and sport maybe in general around inclusion.
One of the things that Azeem said was that he wouldn't let his son or daughter play cricket.
Yeah.
And I just wondered whether that was still the purveying mood in Yorkshire.
I mean, I've had parents say that to me over the last few months, parents who have got young girls and young boys who are playing club cricket or even just participatory sport, saying this is the reason why we don't want them to engage in sport. This is the reason why we'd rather they're focused on what they see as an academic education and gain a good qualification so that they can get jobs and they can make something of themselves. What it is that they now don't have trust in the institution. There was very little trust in thinking that you could make a career out of sport anyway, being from a South Asian background. So that's half the battle sometimes. But actually now I feel like there's even little trust to say that, well, even if you do make it into sport, I've seen how you get treated and I don't want my son or my daughter to go through that.
Mm-hmm. James, one of the things that you mentioned was that you speak to Azeem on a regular basis. So what is he making of what's going on right now and what Yorkshire are trying to do, and perhaps the other clubs as well in county cricket that we've heard about?
I think with Azeem, it's worth just kind of going back a step and thinking about how Yorkshire dealt with his situation. Because to me, there were two very distinct parts of Azeem's allegations or the overall picture. There was initially his allegations of racism and institutional racism at the club. And then the secondary, there was the scant disregard of the club to what he'd actually said and the fact they completely ignored what he'd said. And I think it was actually that actually bit Yorkshire on the backside rather than the actual racism itself, which is quite sad. It was the fact that they mismanaged the situation. They kind of adopted a bunker mentality where they hoped it would go away. And I think in society in general, but certainly in cricket, there's probably three things that actually make people take racism seriously. I think there's the potential bad PR. If it's going to affect individuals and their reputations, then they do something. I think there's financial loss. If it's going to affect a company economically, they do something. And then, as we saw it, well, we've seen all excuse me, nearly dropped my phone. As we've seen all three of these in the Azeem Rafiq case, the political intervention, and if it gets bigger than the organisation itself, and all three of those, fortunately or unfortunately, affected Yorkshire County Cricket Club. I say unfortunately because I think as a fan, I'm very sad with where Yorkshire are at the moment, and I think, myself and Azeem have had this conversation regularly with both Yorkshire fans. Yeah, he played for the club. He's very proud to have a Yorkshire cap. He represented that organisation with pride and with passion. And one thing always makes me confuses me to a degree is how the people in charge at Yorkshire didn't know Azeem. Because if you actually watch Azeem play, and if you'd spoken to Azeem, you know that he's an obstinate so-and-so. The way he played, he was a fighter, he was a scrapper. And he was never going to let this go. And the club were very naive, I think, in that they thought that this would just blow over and disappear. And that was their undoing. And I think, just kind of to repeat, I think the actual allegations of racism, if they'd actually, well, first of all, if they dealt with it initially, if they'd actually taken his allegations seriously, taken appropriate action, listened to him, it would never have got this far. It certainly wouldn't have got as far as the DCMS hearing. But the fact that they didn't do is actually more of their undoing than the actual racism itself, which is the wrong way around, isn't it? You know, you should be in the dock for racism, not for how you mismanaged the allegations of racism. Both are bad. Don't get me wrong, but I think it's also worth Barney just making the point that this isn't just a Yorkshire problem. You know, Yorkshire are very much in the headlines at the moment because of the way they mismanaged Azeem's allegations. But there are whistleblowing hotlines around the country. There are people coming forward from all of the 18 counties, giving their experiences of racism in the past. And I think Yorkshire have been unlucky in a way that they've had somebody as obstinate as Azeem who dug his heels in and wouldn't let this go. Because I think that the thing I've noticed more than anything, talking to Azeem all the way through this, was how it affected him personally. How somebody that comes forward and is brave enough and confident enough or desperate enough to actually make the allegations in the first place isn't seen as being the solution, and he's seen as being the problem. And I've spoken to a lot of people during the last 18 months since I interviewed Azeem who have said that, you know, I have got issues, but I daren't come forward because it might actually affect my future employment opportunities. It might affect my ability to go into coaching. I might lose that contract, or I might, you know, I'll be seen as an issue. And I think a lot of people want to blend into the background and just have an easy life or a more comfortable life. And actually doing what Azeem's done, putting your head on the block and getting yourself out there. We've seen how people, you know, there was, during the DCMS thing, there was an outpouring of sympathy and emotion for Azeem. How can this have been allowed to happen to one individual? Azeem's never painted himself as being an angel. None of us are angels. None of us are perfect. And Azeem's done things wrong in the past. And obviously the backlash that came off the back of the DCMS hearing, you know, digging up quotes from the past and trying to discredit Azeem in a way was almost cricket's way of squashing him. And that was something I saw quite a lot during the time speaking to him between the podcast and the DCMS. Because there was a lot of attempts to try and discredit Azeem and make him feel, you know, Azeem's the person at fault here. It's not the club at fault. And I think that is something which cricket, you know, if cricket's ever in denial about racism, it's that part of the process. Even if it is just somebody's perception that I might be damaged if I actually speak the truth, there is that perception that is the landscape, and that is wrong. And cricket needs to do something about that.
Sunday, you want to come in?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It's necessary to have this reckoning. It's difficult. It's difficult for the people involved when people say, "Why did you put up with it?" It's difficult to take on, but it's really difficult and uncomfortable to have the reckoning. And I think you've got to recognise that. So there's a real, you know, the reason they think it can go away is it has always gone away before. There's a great deal of offence at what, you know, Imran Khan said about Yorkshire and Asians, the Pakistani community, you know, back in the 1999 World Cup, and everyone said this isn't true at all. We haven't had any Asian players yet, but it will happen. So there's a feeling of progress, but it had gone away before, and it didn't go away this time. And I think every sporting institution and a lot of other institutions be looking at why things are going to stay up now, and that there were different interventions. You know, it was partly because of the anti-racism protests we had, I think, that changed the level of atmosphere, you know, made Azeem Rafiq himself go back into it. That totally changed how some of the politicians, especially the sponsors, responded. And suddenly you've got, you know, Tetley Beer and Have a Good Spring Water, you know, pulling out because of racism. Suddenly the ECB is saying, well, we'll pull out too. And you've got a total collapse of governance in a way you weren't expecting. So that's a dramatic new pressure that people are under. We've now got this question, though, I think is really important. If we want to focus on the future, what do we do with all of the pain from the past? And I thought, in a way, the way in which Azeem Rafiq was challenged about his anti-Semitic comments, had to own them, had to respond to them, actually gives him a model, which I sort of sense he's saying when everyone's interested in the who said what to who. and what can we pin on individuals? Because we find it so hard to talk about institutions and so easy to talk about individuals. And what we want to do is make it possible for people and institutions and cultures to change. So I think we've got to find a way of hearing the experiences that people have had, doing something with them, recording them, and working out how to, forgive, move on, make people part of the solution. At the moment, we haven't offered, I think, the members of Yorkshire County Cricket Club the role we want them to play in being part of the future. We're just saying to them, you should have been a bit more alert over the last 10, 15, 20 years.
I'll come to you in a minute, James. I just want to ask Halima a quick question. You're listening to this. You're a diversity inclusion expert. Why is it so difficult for people to put the head above the parapet until there's a crunch moment?
I think as James mentioned something when you were talking, and that really hit me in answering that, Barney, is when you talked about actually when we do come forward, or when people of colour do come forward and talk about some of the discrimination that they're facing, sometimes they won't come forward out of fear that actually this will jeopardise my chances, whether it's as an athlete, but I'm talking maybe from an administration level. You're working at a certain level in sport and you think, if I want to climb up this career ladder, I want to become a director, I want to become a head of department. But if I start to talk about some of the challenges that there are in this current organisation and the culture and the way that it's run, you already feel that you have imposter syndrome. Then you start speaking and talking differently, and you just think it's easy to remove that from an organisational point of view than actually listen to that. And this is the reason why you don't see many people in the hierarchies of sport. And for me, there has to be a cultural change. There has to be leadership, which is more visible. And we'll use Yorkshire as the example. Azeem Rafiq came out and he talked about the head coach and he talked about the CEO. To this day, not that I'm aware of, have anything come out where they've acknowledged Azeem's comments or even apologised for the way that they've handled it. They just seem to have vanished into the distance. And then you had Lord Patel come in, a person of colour, apologise to another person of colour. And for me, in this whole what's happened with Yorkshire is the one thing that I would probably disagree with Lord Patel on, in that he shouldn't have apologised for something that he didn't do. And I know he's representing the organisation now, but you acknowledge and you take that forward. But if people don't look at it from their own personal, and for me, this comes back to people have to acknowledge that they are biased, that there is racism that exists. And only then, especially from a leadership point of view, can you move forwards.
Thank you. James, you wanted to come in and I cut you off.
I was just going to respond to something that Sundar said. I think, the term cancel culture, we've seen, I think people have said things in the past. People have said things when they're teenagers. People have said, some horrific things. But I think in the greater scheme of things, we need to allow people to be different. And I think if you cancel people because of something they've said that is racist and abhorrent and whatever else, yes, of course, they need to be accountable and they need to take responsibility for things that they've said. But I think if you just cancel them completely, you don't give anybody the chance to jump over the fence. I always think of, I don't know what these percentages are right or wrong, but so there's 90% of the world that is not racist and 10% that is. But if you cancel everybody on the 10% side of the fence and don't give them the chance to actually learn and be different and jump over the fence, in 20 years' time, you're going to have exactly the same percentages. So you need to have the ability to think, and I'm not clever enough to actually know how to do this, but you need to obviously take responsibility and be accountable if you've done something racist. But you need to have some way where you can actually help that person or encourage that person to jump that fence and get onto the other side, so that 90% goes up.
I'm going to sort of take some questions from some of our listeners, some of our audience panel, and I want to broaden the debate out. So Lee Pinkerton, and who's with the Cream Project, and Faral Iqbal sort of are asking that football, racism has existed for so long. Why is it that we're only just now hearing about cricket? Sundar?
I think the challenges are different in football and cricket. I think it's interesting that cricket never had a campaign like Kick It Out in football to challenge racism. But I think part of the story here is that it was the kind of culture, the things that weren't said, you know, the nicknames. It wasn't as overt most of the time as the sort of overt racism that, you know, the West Brom players faced in the 70s and 80s. So it was a different kind of issue. But it was also, cricket is the sport with enormous minority participation and then the segregation of that participation. Whereas I think football's in a different place. I think the Asian community is still a bit distant from the football institutions. There's still work to do on
because there aren't enough Asian players in the game.
Yeah, and that, you know, it's if your parents' family didn't play, don't know the kind of link. So there's been a lot of stereotyping, I think, of Asians, why it's not going to happen, and it still needs to happen. So every sport has a different challenge. I think in cricket it's clear that there's enormous participation in the amateur game, but much too segregated and much too separate, and therefore no real pathways into the professional game. But all other sports don't even have the diversity that cricket has had. And so most other sports, except for maybe athletics and boxing, you know, have got some diversity. Mostly they're not even at the starting line, I would say. And people are saying the door's open. If people don't come, how do we know the problems with us, not with them? We don't know why there's nobody here, but we're perfectly inclusive. I think most sports haven't really started on the journey that football and cricket in different ways have been challenged to respond to.
James, you're a sports journalist. Do you agree with Sundar that what's going on is that there is this buy-in in cricket, but not elsewhere?
I think there's buy-in in cricket because cricket has been forced to buy in, because they've been, you know, pushed into a corner. I think cricket was very happy with wearing T-shirts and having slogans in match day programs and stuff like that, and thinking that was enough to, you know, that was anti-racism. We're fully inclusive. Look at the cricket landscape. There's people of all colours play cricket. You know, we travel around the world and there's all of these different cultures involved. So therefore, how can we be racist? And the majority of people that are making the decisions in cricket, having said that, are white people, are people that look like me, who are sitting around board tables probably making very well-intentioned decisions, but they're making well-intentioned decisions from their own background and from their own perspective, and not really going out there and considering how that affects other people. I mean, there's the 12-point plan that the ECB have brought in off the back of the Azeem stuff. They've got this 12-point plan about how they're going to develop cricket and make it more inclusive going forward. I think the key thing with that is to actually go out to different cultures, and actually make them own that plan. You know, actually a lot of people at Lords saying, right, we're having this 12-point plan. This is the way we're going to move forward. This is where we're going to be more inclusive. That's good, and it's a good starting point. But you need to involve everybody in that, because if you end up being just going to a cricket club in Bradford and saying, right, this is the 12-point plan, this is how it's going to work, that's just a white guy telling other people how this is going to operate, isn't it? You need to make people actually own the sport and own the changes in the sport. Otherwise, it's going to be something that's dictated to people, and that isn't a very healthy way forward. But I think Azeem and what we've got now has given Yorkshire cricket a golden ticket, not just Yorkshire.
The whole cricket. Sport, actually. The whole
Absolutely.
Sport.
And probably why further afield, because you have the chance now, because there's a reason to, because it's got as far as it has done and it's blown up as big as it has. You've got the chance to actually draw a line in the sand and have that watershed moment where you can be different, and you have an excuse almost as a committee or a board or whatever to actually make these changes off the back of what Azeem's given you. And basically take everything back to square one, and be honest and be truly open and say, right, you know, we've made mistakes in the past. This hasn't been ideal. We're going to involve everybody. We're going to talk to people. We're going to actually, you know, join hands around the county. I mean, Yorkshire thing about Yorkshire is it actually represents everybody in the county, doesn't it? And Yorkshire is such a massive county, which is you know, wonderful scenery, wonderful people, but wonderful people of all kinds of different backgrounds. And I don't think at the moment or in the past the club has properly represented all of those people. I know from being at the club and working on the management team ahead of internationals, where, you know, people described the Asian population of Bradford as being a revenue stream, or they were potential ticket buyers. They weren't ever really people. And I think the club needs to view people as people, not as potential sales. and that's a big difference. It's it's only probably a slight change, but actually talking to people, actually, what do you want to see? Where do you want to see the club going? Is this your club? Why is it not your club? Actually, really properly talking to people from different communities and involving them and making them feel like it is their club. I mean, the term club is kind of everybody in it together kind of thing. At the moment, I think a lot of county clubs aren't that.
It's about humanising. Halima, Dr. Manish Tile, MBE from the Royal Navy, says, "Good afternoon. I put it to the panel that the only difference between Yorkshire County Cricket Club, both in the racism itself and the handling of it, and any other major UK institution, is that they got caught." And I just wonder whether you agree with that. And he asks, what are the key lessons for other organisations and their people?
Well, yes, they obviously got caught. But I don't think it's just about the fact that they got caught. I think it's the way they handled it as well. There wasn't an acceptance from the club that they were racist. You had the ex-chairman, I think it was the day after he resigned, came on, I don't know if it was a radio interview or on TV, and openly still said, "I don't believe anybody at Yorkshire is racist." So for me, it very much goes back to people have to own their own levels of bias. And if some of that bias leads to racism, to say that, well, you are racist, but you have to be able to accept that first. So I think, yes, they got caught, but there was also no acknowledgement from being caught. And we've talked about this previously here, in the way that they handled it. It wasn't just about the racism. It became this handling more than the actual racism itself. And I think, the lessons for other organisations to learn is, James, you talked about it a little bit before, is shared ownership. It's co-producing. So the ECB have developed a 12-point plan. They've got 4 main ambitions that they want to achieve from that. But actually, how much are they working with the counties and the clubs to say, how do we do this? Because we're not just going to dictate to you how this needs to be delivered and by when.
Your argument is it's top down, and what it really needs is a community engagement.
Yeah, because I think if you want communities, and if we use Yorkshire as the example, if we want Yorkshire to feel like cricket is for them and that club, they are a part of that club, it has to be a shared, whether it's a document, whether it's an intervention, it needs to be co-produced, which then leads to shared ownership. I know that if I'm involved in something from the onset to make a change and to meet that bigger goal and vision of being more inclusive, I'm sat on that table from the start of that conversation. They haven't come to me after producing the document with an action plan and a timeline and then saying, we need to do this. Can you do that bit of it? Because the first thing I'll turn around and say, no. Because I go, you didn't ask. You haven't understood my world. You haven't understood my world, my culture, my environment, but you want me to do this for you. So I think there needs to be more conversations. And yes, them conversations will be very uncomfortable to start off with, but we will eventually lead to a comfortable position where people will start to feel like, I am a part of this club. So therefore, the change has to happen from all of us. And it's not, yes, there's a responsibility around governance for the clubs and the administrators, but actually everyone owns Yorkshire Cricket Club. I'm from Bradford. I'm a Yorkshire woman. I want to be able to go to that club and say, I'm proud to come to this club. It is a part of me. It's part of the history that I'm involved in. So I think there's that one side of co-production with your communities and then shared leadership and ownership from that. But the other thing I'd probably suggest is, in order to get to that point and for you to be able to understand communities and people a bit better is, reverse mentoring. If you don't know of a particular community and culture and some of the challenges that they might have, go and find out, talk to them. I do that. I'm no expert in all the protected characteristics and all the equality laws, but I know that if I don't know something, I will go and find somebody who's got a lived experience in that. And I will go to the effort of trying to find out what is it that I can be doing in my everyday work to ensure that I'm creating more inclusive environments. And it's not just me sat behind a desk thinking I know what the best thing to do is.
Thank you. Sundar and then James.
I think there's a big lesson for every institution in sport and beyond sport, which is that all institutions are going to have to get more confident talking about race, talking about difference and so on. And there's no institution in this country that is fully confident about that. And you only get that confidence if you've got those relationships. So if you're famous, if you're iconic, then you might be more likely to get caught in the spotlight if things go wrong and less able to brush it away. But you look at the census results that we're going to get, this is growing diversity in our country, you're going to have to get more confident about it. If those relationships are very distant, if that feels a very anxious thing to embark on, then you've got to work hard at building better relationships in the way that Halima said. But this idea about shared ownership, James is absolutely right that you need the shared ownership of the plan with the communities. I think there's been too much diversity as outreach, diversity for minorities. Let's have a conversation with the minorities about diversity, and then have the usual conversation with everybody else about everything else. And that isn't shared ownership. So it's as important to have the shared ownership of the majority community, of the membership, of the plans, of the conversation, and so on. And that's where I think, it's a really interesting challenge for somebody like Lord Patel, who I think has done well as a leader in the tone that he struck. People will say, the club should, connect across communities, make this better. He should turn to the members, I think, and say, it's your job to help us reach out, build these bridges. You've got to play a part in this, because otherwise people are sort of sitting there with their arms folded a bit, saying, we've got to be seen to do something about this because of that fuss, but we're looking forward to it going away. They've got to be asked to step up. I had a very positive experience, Barney. My next door neighbour is a Charlton fan, as it happens here in Kent. And Charlton are in League One at the moment, and they get crowds of 14 or 15,000 in a stadium that holds 27,000. So all of the season ticket holders were given 3 free tickets for a match, and said, let's see if we can fill the stadium. And so, my 9-year-old got to go to her first football match, having, filled in the Euro 2020 World chart, because he said, look, we're trying to fill the stadium. Do your children want to go? And I think that's something you could put to the members of Yorkshire. Can you bring people into this ground next season who are younger, who are women, who are from different communities and different backgrounds? Some of the members of the Yorkshire County Club don't have those relationships. Some of them do. That shouldn't just be for the club to do. I think it should be for the whole community to actually try to do that bridging.
James,
can I just really quickly jump in there on that point, in that what I will say is that there's 3 entities to Yorkshire County Cricket Club. You've got the cricket club, the board, and the foundation. And I know over the last couple of years, the board and the foundation have been working very hard, where they have offered these opportunities. And that's 2 communities, especially during the 100, where they've given free tickets away to come in, enjoy kind of the perks of the club, just that whole club environment. Because I think one thing that does for younger generation is it's an aspiration. It inspires them to then want to be able to say, I am a part of this club, and maybe I can get into the setup, whether it's as a player, whether it's as a coach or an administrator. So I think in everything that we're talking about, there are things that are happening, unfortunately, because of the Azeem Rafiq thing. Well, I say unfortunately, it's good that it's come out. Some of that stuff is being kind of swept out of the way of what the clubs have been doing as well, which has been quite positive as well.
James, Amir Khan, and I'm presuming it's not the boxer Amir Khan, or the actor, Bollywood star Amir Khan, says that reflective role models can play a part. What 2 things would the panel want to see for immediate change?
Can I just come back on just one thing that was said about being caught? I think it's important to remember, I'm not trying to blow my own trumpet here, I think it's important to remember that Yorkshire got called out by the press. They didn't get called out by cricket. They didn't get called out by necessarily the supporters until it kind of grew a little bit of a head of steam. If it hadn't been for myself and George DeBell, who writes for ESPN Cricinfo, who continue to write stories on this and continue to put pressure on the club to do differently, that independent investigation that wasn't independent wouldn't have happened, and B, it wouldn't have ended up where it did do. So I think the game needs to look at itself in terms of the reporting mechanisms and in terms of how it actually views incidents of racism, because I think it's very easy in cricket to, as the questioner suggested, to kind of sweep it under the table to some degree. And what as well, I mean, my concern is that what is a headline one day in the UK, people have very short attention spans and people move on to something else. It'll be Boris one day, it'll be Azeem the next, and it'll be England playing football the next, and people move on, don't they? And we need to have somehow, as a country, as a community, as people that just care about doing the right thing, we need to keep people accountable. We need to keep the pressure on for change. It's very easy. This 12-point plan that the ECB announced before Christmas, I've not heard of it since. And
so I think it's our job, isn't it, as press, to hold the feet to the fire.
The Ashes comes up, and all the fallout from the Ashes that starts to hit the headlines, and it's very easy to kind of to lose momentum with something. So we need to, and that this is all, I think it's important to say as well, it's important that white people own racism and are part of the process and talk to people and understand it. But I think it comes from all different cultures. All different cultures are at fault to various degrees with racism. And I think we need to be open to that as well. And in the same way that we all need to kind of learn and grow and understand people's cultures. That works every single which way, I think.
Okay, look, I want to go back to the Amir Khan question in just a moment, but Borja Karabhadra said, "I'm the chairman of Luton Town, an Indians County Cricket Club in Bedfordshire, one of the most diverse cricket clubs in the country. The 12-point plan from the ECB is a step in the right direction, but is in danger of becoming a tick box exercise because the point you make, Halima, which is that there's been no consultation at grassroots." So let's go to the Amir Khan question, which is, what two things would the panel, starting off with you, if I may, Halima, would you want to see for immediate change?
So I suppose the first one is that co-production, because co-production will lead to shared ownership. You feel a part of something, you're more likely to put more time, effort, and passion into bringing that to life. And I suppose my second thing, and I think I'm going to talk just from my experience in sport administration, is we need to stop looking at equality, diversity, and inclusion as projects that stop and start. We're all guilty of it.
How do you mean? Stop and
so
start?
We're all like interventions. So it's like, okay, let's plough £2 million into South Asian project. Football do similar with the Asians in Football project. It's needed, but it should be seen as a kind of startup, almost like it's a business startup. You could say it's a resource that has to go into a particular area because positive action needs to be achieved in that particular area due to underrepresentation. But I think I say it's like a royal we, just because of my experience in sport, is we do look at things as project ends. But I think this is more than that. This is about how do we create behaviour change? How do we create a culture that's going to go beyond the lifeline of the project? So if we're going to plough in, I don't know, £2 million, or we're going to decide to put something together over the next 12 months, how do we ensure after the 12 months that doesn't then just stop there and then it becomes a story in history? Actually, we want to be able to look back at that and say that intervention was needed. It kick-started something, but we're still seeing the kind of fruits of that labour years and years on. And that culture and that behaviour has started to ingrain into people's mind. I feel like we have to start from that point as opposed to just looking at things in a short term. And, organisations like Sport England, UK Sport, well, probably say more Sport England more than anything, they're talking about tackling inequalities. Tackling inequalities is not something that you start, in March and finish in April. Tackling inequalities is lifelong, because then organisations and then communities that you're trying to tackle them inequalities with, they are still going to be there after that.
Sundar, how do you stop it becoming a tick box?
Yeah, I think it's right to say that
that's your dog, right?
To be more engagement from below and with the grassroots as well, but people wanted to see something very quickly. So it's fine to have a top 12-point plan right from the top. You've got to go and do the engagement and make it co-owned. What struck me in cricket especially and across sports is that you do your minority outreach over here, engage Asian communities, and you do your anti-racism slogans over there for a different audience, and that you're missing the point about social connection, about co-production in the truest sense. And so I think you've got to engage across the communities properly.
James, what are your two thoughts?
I think there needs to be an independent body in sport, a bit like Ofsted in education or something like that, that is able to go around purely on equality issues. And
but if we think about every single sport, if we take the ECB, who's the regulator of cricket, isn't it ECB's responsibility in cricket to do that?
I think it should be the ECB's responsibility to put this into progress and make it independent. But it's not, if you actually think about it, Barney, it's not in the ECB's interest to have elements of racism popping up left, right, and centre around the country, is it? Because it makes them look bad. There's a kind of an extent to that where if the governing body is getting peppered with racism scandals left, right, and centre, it's not making the governing body look very good. So it needs to be somebody who is not held accountable by the ECB. He's not employed by the ECB to go out there and actually look with fresh eyes and with elements of good practice in their back pocket to actually give advice. I'm not talking about punishing clubs. I'm not talking about blowing things open unless there's really bad examples, but give people guidance on how to do this. I mean, we talk about education and taking cricketers into the classrooms. I can tell you now that you take a cricketer into a classroom 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the last thing they want to do is sit there and get talked to about something. They're there to play cricket, and it just goes in one ear and out the other. They're not bothered. I think the second thing as well is that the pathway schemes and the way through cricket. We spoke earlier about the fact that there's a lot of participation of minority groups at grassroots level playing for their clubs, and that is not reflected on the professional in the professional game. And there's a reason for that. There's plenty of reasons for that. I spoke to Dr. Thomas Fletcher on my podcast, and we went through this in quite a lot of detail. In that, there's so many stumbling blocks in that. A lot of coaches are white. You don't get very many people of color as coaches because they're deemed to kind of do things slightly differently. A young Asian player is maybe more likely to go out there and hit across the line and just be enjoying himself as a youngster, and that's deemed to be not cricket by somebody that's looking to be for somebody to be playing in the V and stuff like that. So many stumbling blocks in the pathway through from being a youngster enjoying cricket to actually having these ambitions to play for Yorkshire or England or whoever, which need to be taken out of the way. Somebody needs to actually step back and properly talk to people and investigate how those stumbling blocks can be taken out there. That's not to say that Yorkshire should be made up of 11 players of colour. If Yorkshire's an all white county, or the first 11's all white, that's fine for me, as long as everybody has had the right, the same amount of chances to actually represent the club. And at the moment, I don't think those chances exist in the same way across the board.
Well, that brings me nicely on to Jill Rutter, Spirit of 2012, who asks a question: do we need a complete change of management at the top of cricket to be truly inclusive sport? I want to broaden it to not just cricket, but to the whole of sport. Do we need a complete change of management? Halima?
I think it comes back to James' point. People will always say you've got to get the best people in the job as well. You can't just give jobs to anyone. However, at the same time of saying that, there needs to be more diversity in management, and from two parts in that is the seen diversity, but also the unseen.
Yeah,
because you can have diversity at a very senior management level, but if they've all had the same upbringing, if they've all had the same level of education, the diversity is not going to exist apart from what you can see. So I think there needs to be diversity at both levels in order for management to be able to change their systems and their processes. It isn't just about everyone looking different to each other. It's also about how we all think differently, but appreciating and respecting that it's okay for people to think differently as well. And if 5 people are all thinking the same and one is thinking differently, it's not a case of that one person is wrong. It's that we have to accept that that's the world that we live in.
Yep. Sundar?
It's not about a complete change of management, I think, and that's almost ducking out of the issue. I mean, obviously, if there's a very toxic culture that has been created, then you need to have change at the top of the people who've been responsible for that. But actually, you need to use the experience that's there, and you also need, I think, which we're missing, is a positive vision about what success looks like, because the thing that makes it a tick box exercise is the sense that this is all compliance, put in place the right reporting schemes, and then say it's all done. And the positive vision is inclusion, where diversity becomes a norm. And so if it's not, a third of women and then half the people are women, that becomes normal, not exceptional. That we're talking about 1 in 6 people in our country being Black, Asian, or mixed race. So you want, a normal dressing room, a normal boardroom to have the right levels of diversity. Obviously, in something like football, you've got enormous diversity on the pitch and no diversity in most boardrooms. And so there's obviously a barrier there. But I think if people say it's time for us to get out of the way and let the people who know about this take over, you're losing what the responsibility is, which is to have these institutions, these centers of power, cultural power in our society have to be equally open. And, you know, ethnic diversity is one thing, class diversity is another thing, sexuality, gender. So just the normalness, not the specialness of somebody being there and then being asked to speak for whole groups of people. We're probably 15, 20 years away from getting there. But that's the positive vision we want.
I hope, Farah Iqbal, that answers your question about tick boxes and superficiality. Let's go to Dr. Manoj Joshi, who's a DL, a deputy lieutenant. How can knee-jerk responses be turned into sustainable, long-term, irreversible change? James, do you want to take that?
I agree with the sentiment of the question, to be honest. I think at the moment we are, ECB's under pressure, Yorkshire's under pressure to change and change tonight or today or yesterday and to do things. And, you know, this, you know, racism isn't something that has just started, is it? You know, racism has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years in various
and some of our audience is asking, why are we still talking about it?
Yeah. But I think at the moment there's pressure on these organisations to change. Obviously, I mean, going back to the initial first question, Yorkshire, I think, had to get rid of the hierarchy at Yorkshire because they were still, you know, Halima mentioned it earlier, they were still in denial. They don't think they've done anything wrong. I think if you actually ask the outgoing chief executive if he's done anything wrong, he'd still say no, which is bewildering to me because it's quite obvious that the processes and you know, it just wasn't followed. So, you know, I think if it is, as Sundar said, if it is a massive toxic environment, you have to have change. But I think knee-jerk reactions are dangerous because you are doing it because you've been embarrassed and you're forced into doing it rather than because you see it as being the right thing to do and actually really want to own a change in society and a change in cricket. So I think, you know, it needs to be thought through a lot more than that. I think, you know, you need to do the proper research. You need to go out there into the communities and ask people what their visions are as well, and actually make it a sustainable thing. Where, as I said before, everybody owns it and everybody wants to be part of it. You know, if you own something, if you're you know, white, brown, black, whatever, playing for a cricket club in the you know, in Bradford or further afield from where I'm sitting at the moment. You want to actually feel as if you're part of the sport, that you own the change, that it's your change, and you can see a purpose for that change, and you can see it actually might actually create something better in the future. I think the 12-point plans and just throwing them out there are done for the right reasons potentially, but I think they're dangerous because you may be not doing, you know, you change for the sake of it and taking cricket down a different path. How do you know that path's the right path?
Yeah.
So I think you need to do it a little bit more measured than that. And change isn't going to happen next week, 2 weeks, next year. You know, the perfect society probably doesn't exist.
The frustration for me is that I say I've been reporting on this for 14 years, so that's 2 generations, and I'm just gobsmacked that, you know, okay, yeah, I'll accept that things have improved. But I'm just gobsmacked, like many in the audience, that we're still having to talk about it.
I don't think, Barney, I think a lot of white people are a little bit reluctant to speak on the subject. As we saw with Ryan Sidebottom yesterday, you start speaking about racism, you can potentially slip up and get yourself into trouble. I think a lot of people from all sides don't understand the histories of racism. You go, like I say, it dates back hundreds and hundreds of years, racism, slavery, Martin Luther King in America, whatever else, you know, all the way through to what we're experiencing now. I think there have been improvements. I think people are much more likely to call people out on social media than they ever were before. But I think there are also, social media has given people a platform to be, quite frankly, horrific at times. And, you know, we saw that with the football, didn't we? And at the end of the Euros with the 3 black lads that missed the penalties, how that, you know, spilt over and brought in the worst of our society after it's, you know, the beauty of that sport, you know, I thought Gareth Southgate and this New England, and we were representing everybody, was fantastic at the start of it. The public letter he wrote to explain why they were taking the knee and everything was that's what proper inclusion and proper thoughts actually look like. And
it's great leadership, actually. It's great leadership.
Absolutely.
because he said,
but by the time
I made the decision and the buck stops with me.
Yeah, but by the time the last penalty was missed, then we saw the worst side of it, didn't we? And we saw the kind of kickback to all of that as well. And so we're a long way from being perfect in our world. We're a long way from it.
Halima, Liz Purbrick asks a question which I think is really apposite, which is this: how do we get people to move from being a bystander, seeing or hearing things that they don't agree with, but feeling that it doesn't affect them, to taking action and not relying on the people affected to call it out?
It's a brilliant question. And it's at times it's about people's own courage. It's about people's own confidence as well, and being comfortable to be in a situation where you may realize that if nobody speaks up for somebody who's been marginalized or has experienced racism or homophobic abuse or anything of the sort, am I willing to stand up, as you mentioned, push my kind of head above the parapet and say something about that? Because only when you do that, people will start to realize, and they've checked, you're checking on them to say, actually, what you've said and what you've done is wrong. And I'm not comfortable being in that environment where these types of conversations are happening, where we're not being an ally with each other. But I think the challenge that you have is not many people will do that, because it's easier to stay silent and just be like, oh, they didn't mean it, or maybe you've taken it the wrong way.
Or it's banter.
Oh, it's banter. Yes, there you go. Or it's banter. So I think the intent can always be changed over by the person saying it. Say, well, I didn't mean it like that. You've taken it the wrong way. But actually, we have to be comfortable to have the conversation to say, well, that's how you said it. This is how I took it, by the way. And some things, and I don't want you to do it again. But having somebody else come forward and do that for you speaks volumes, because it means, and this is the whole thing that we're trying to come to, aren't we? It's inclusion. It's belonging. Because when somebody else sticks up for me, for example, if I'm a victim of racism, when somebody else sticks up for me, I feel like I belong in that environment. And it's for organisations. So say, for example, if there is abuse going on at a county game at Yorkshire, what are Yorkshire doing to put in place steps to say to people, it is okay for you to stand up to that?
So would you agree that really sometimes it's so easy to put the onus on those who are the victims rather than those who see it, and can intervene and step in?
Yes, but in either case, whether it's the victim or whether it's a bystander or an ally, that signal really comes from organizational culture. It really comes from leadership, team leadership, club leadership, organizational leadership. Everybody knows when they're in an institution which is saying, these are the values, we stand up for this, and we're going to stick up for it. And a culture where somebody's going to say quietly, you're right, actually, but don't get a reputation as a troublemaker. That won't go down well around here. You know which kind of institution you're in. So if you want people to be braver, then you've got to do it. I think we've seen cultural shifts in our society. I saw cultural shifts inside football stadiums. There are cultural shifts about what you do or don't do on a bus or a train, in the street, in the pub, up to a point, in school playgrounds, and so on. So bringing about that, people don't know what to do as a bystander, for example, on social media. So if you step in, you might have to police the internet for the rest of all time. So it's easier to step out. People feel that they would, if they saw overt racism, they would speak out and step up, or would feel bad if they didn't. And then they don't quite know what to do about these grey areas and these boundaries and these things taken another way. So we've got to bring that conversation out into the open and have a culture that allows that, because otherwise you get, this is the tick box point. Here are all the codes, here are all the rules, here are the disciplinary procedures. By the way, we won't like people that use them. You know if that's the signal that you're getting.
Yeah. But I think Macpherson helped us, though, didn't he? When he said that a racial incident is in the eye of the beholder. It doesn't have to be the person who is being racially abused who reports it. It can be anybody who thinks it's a racial incident.
I think that can change the culture. Macpherson is a brilliant example, as James was saying, and we've seen it in sport. We've had flashpoint approaches to race. Stephen Lawrence inquiry, we're all very concerned, but maybe we lose the momentum. We get the Azeem Rafiq scandal. Do we lose the momentum? Because we're a more diverse society, this is going to be around more, and so we're going to have to not just do it around flashpoints. Macpherson is also trying to get us to take institutional racism more seriously, but there's a problem with trying to focus on institutions. Institutions are boring. And racism is exciting, it's hot, it's something people get angry about, and it's something that you sort of sounds like, you're institutionally racist or you're not. We've all got journeys to go on over the next 5 or 10 years. We should have a cooler term. It's very hard to say, I am as a football club, I'm institutionally racist, but everybody's welcome. So what you have to say is that's our vision of inclusion. There are disparities. We haven't got the culture we want. We're going on a journey, but it's very hard to own, I think, institutional racism because of what the R word feels like it means. It feels like it means bad intentions, a bad heart. What it actually means is that unwittingly, despite your structures, it hasn't been as inclusive of people, but you didn't realize why, you didn't notice. So I think we need a different way of talking about that, because I think the term makes people close down, bunker down, and it's very hard actually to accept it.
I want to pick up on something that James said about South Asians being seen as a cash cow almost. That they weren't seen as human beings; they were seen as a financial thing. Halima, from your perspective, is it possible that the business imperative can drive this? I'm not talking about it being treated as human beings, but what I'm talking about is quite simple. We know that when sponsorship is taken away, we know when people take away their business, change happens. And I just wonder whether we acknowledge that and use diversity as a business case.
I think diversity needs to be a business case, and there's all the research out there that says when organisations are more diverse, not just in their kind of setups, when organisations have more diverse sponsors as well, that it attracts more people to the club, and there's it increases their revenue, their productivity. But you don't look at these communities as as James mentioned there, as cash cows. I'm South Asian, by the way, James, and I haven't got a penny. So, but I think it's important that, as you say, that this is also an opportunity now for Yorkshire to engage more with the businesses around Yorkshire. There are so many. I live in Bradford, and there are so many South Asian businesses, very successful South Asian businesses that have got international recognition that Yorkshire can really start to engage with. But one of the things they have to first do is build a trust back up with these communities, with these businesses. And I almost feel that businesses hold a position that maybe in the future, if Yorkshire can sign a deal with some of these businesses, the communities will start to look at the club in a different light. Because people will, if you've got somebody like Myla Hall, for example, in Bradford, who decide to have a sponsorship with Yorkshire, how many people will look at that and thinking, oh, do you know what? Maybe there is a change here. Maybe there is being a shift here. It might drive more people to the club.
James?
I think it's worth pointing out that when Azeem first spoke up and there was an initial kind of role of support for him, there was a number of about 50 businesses that signed a petition or something like that to say that Yorkshire should do something about this. I think Azeem felt very let down by those businesses by the end of the process, because they had ended up posing at Bradford's Park Avenue cricket grounds with the club, because they felt they could get something out of it. A lot of them attended, they got hospitality boxes at the test match because the club was playing the game at the time. So they turned their back on their Azeem, as he was, and ended up jumping into bed with the cricket club. So I think if if you got principles, stick by them. And it works both ways, that.
The thing I was most encouraged by, James, in terms of sponsors, was in that point when the story had broken on how big was it going to be. The sponsors were crucial. But the thing that really encouraged me was where Yorkshire Tea thought Middle Yorkshire was, that Yorkshire Tea thought Middle Yorkshire was about saying, sort this out now. It's unacceptable. And it was important, I thought, it was Yorkshire Tea and not Nike that was doing that. I hope they were right about Middle Yorkshire.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I think that there were two things I think really caught fire in Azeem's situation. There was the Saqib Javid and his tweet, and then there was the sponsor starting to vacate the website and saying we're not happy to support you on this. So there was the financial and PR embarrassment at the same time, wasn't there?
Yeah. Rosa Arias Yeag, I hope I pronounced your name right, Rosa. Forgive me if I haven't. She says, people who suffer racism are perceived as less professional when they call it out. And what she's suggesting is allyship. Allyship is the key, since allies have a safer position to speak up would anybody disagree with that on the panel? Because I certainly think that if you are part of a family, if you are part of the tribe and you see something happening, and it's happened to me where people have stepped in, where I've needed that friendship, that allyship, and as a person of colour, I felt more secure when I know that somebody who is white has stuck up for me and said, no, you can't do that.
Can I just jump in there quickly, Fanny? I think it is really important. Absolutely don't disagree with that statement. However, through kind of a lived experience of my own in a previous roles and what I see going on as well is, I think sometimes it depends where that allyship comes from in the chain of command. And I think if your ally is somebody who's in a senior leadership director position, there will probably be more likely to be noise made. But as if that ally is somebody maybe who's as your peer or working in more of a grassroots, you still need that as a human being. After everything that's said
in power, isn't it? It's what goes back to Sundar's point, which is about leadership.
Yeah,
I think we've also heard from James there. James, you've been a very good ally and using the voice you have by being there for the long slog. So I think allyship matters a lot. I'm quite skeptical of a lot of the American discourse around allyship because it's almost like a sort of white liberal conversation among white liberals, and I think institutions just need to be normally diverse and reflect all of the diversity. So I think all of this stay in your lane, check your privilege stuff can put allies off actually to some extent, but we need shared identities, shared culture, shared responsibilities. There's no doubt that support from people from a majority background though makes a big difference.
Okay, we're in the final 5 minutes and I just want to go through the panel. I am Boris Johnson with my tousled hair, and you have a chance to address me with 1 point, just 1 point. What are you going to ask the Prime? What's your ask of the Prime Minister, James?
Flippant one resigned, but that's a totally different thing. That maybe come down to lockdowns and parties, but I think the government ran an investigation where they basically said institutional racism didn't exist. So I don't think Boris is the right person to talk to be quite frank, because institutional racism is rife. It's everywhere, and it's just the way the country is, isn't it? And it's because the country is run by white people, primarily for white people, and it's having to change because, as Sundar said, there are more and more people of colour coming into the country. And I think, just a general point for me to finish with, I think I've learned more about race and racism in the last 18 months than I ever really wanted to. And, I started to own it myself now and started to call people out. In the past, I haven't called people out at times, and I'm ashamed of that. And I think that the majority of my learnings have come from mixing with people who are different to me. And I think until you start doing that, and you start talking to people that come from different religious backgrounds, different cultures, in different countries. I'm the sort of person that goes on holiday, doesn't sit around the pool, but goes off and eats local food and talks to local people. And I think by doing that, you learn far more about people. And then when it comes down to it, and you're working in an organisation with other people, you kind of understand them already a little bit more, and it's easier, isn't it? I think there's far too mistrust, and people from both sides stand away from each other. We need to kind of get down and dirty and talk to people a lot more.
Sundar?
I'm happy to have a message to Boris Johnson or to Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak next, or Keir Starmer. And I think it's this: whether race unites or divides very much depends on how that public conversation is framed or led. So we had an exceptionally polarized debate about the Sewell report into different camps, who was in denial, what was going on, and yet some months later we can all agree that Yorkshire County Cricket Club has got a problem of institutional racism. And in a way, I think Sajid Javi did a great thing there with the intervention he made, bringing the government behind that, probably because they learned something from the footballers taking the knee and the way the public reacted. So I thought that was a positive chance to have a less polarised debate. We're going to be talking about this more. It's got a lot of heat in it. And I think our leaders can put the heat in, or they can help to manage the heat and help us try and find the common ground. And actually, you get a much more American culture that we don't want, Donald Trump's America, if they choose to dial up the heat on all sides. So that will be my message to the current or next leader.
Halima, you have the final word.
Oh, I'll be saying to Boris, thank you for your time. I've got this now. So, no, look, I'll keep it quite simple. And I suppose this, whether it's Boris or whether it's the ECB, Yorkshire Cricket, or any sporting institution, I would be saying to them, if you are going to provide a service to communities and people, understand them before you want them to understand what you want them to do. And it's as simple as that.
Panel, I want to thank you very much. And just let me just sum up. I think the messages I'm getting, and it's from the chat, and thank you to everybody who has contributed to this wonderful debate. Thank you to British Futures and to the Asian Media Group for organising it. I think we know that we've got lots to do, and it's going to take time before we actually nail it, if ever we do. It's not just about cricket, it involves the whole sport. I know people get twitchy about this, but because, you know, business, we always argue about the business case. And, you know, that there are people who say, let's not just concentrate on what we can get out of ethnic minorities, but what we can actually put in. It's about leadership and political intervention, and that we ask real people for their ideas to join in and have real conversations. So on that note, thank you ever so much. If you've enjoyed today's event, my name is Barney Chowdhury. If you haven't, it's George Alagaya. Good night. God bless. Bye-bye.